The invitation didn't make headlines at first. No parade, no leaked photos, no ceremonial smiles. Just a quiet confirmation that changed everything. Canada's Prime Minister was heading to Beijing on a full state visit, personally invited by China's president. That alone signaled a shift. But the real twist wasn't the destination, it was the timing. For years, Canada-China relations weren't merely strained, they were frozen solid. Arrests, retaliation, silence. A diplomatic winter that seemed permanent. And yet suddenly doors were opening, not out of goodwill, out of necessity. This visit doesn't exist in a vacuum. It comes on the heels of a tense European tour where Canada reinforced ties with NATO and EU leaders as global anxiety surged. That anxiety has a name: unpredictability. In recent months, long-held assumptions have collapsed. Borders once considered untouchable are now spoken of casually. Force is no longer hypothetical. And when a major power shows that sovereignty is negotiable, every serious country has to recalibrate, fast. Canada is doing exactly that. This is not a pivot away from allies. It's not a dramatic break or a symbolic reset. It's something more subtle and more dangerous for anyone who relies on pressure: options. In Europe, Canada reinforced legitimacy and security. In Asia, it is reopening economic and diplomatic channels, not because trust has returned, but because leverage has. State visits are not handed out lightly. They are deliberate signals, hierarchical, strategic. China did not extend this invitation out of courtesy. It did so because Canada's relevance has increased, not declined. A stable, institutionally trusted country with predictable supply chains matters more in a volatile world. And then there's the economics: sharp, immediate, unavoidable. Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles was introduced under a different global context, aligned closely with U.S. policy at the time. That context has changed. Tariffs and trade pressure have begun to hit Canada directly: autos, manufacturing, supply chains. Alignment without protection stops making sense. If tariffs are eased, even partially, and retaliatory measures on Canadian exports are lifted, the impact would be instant. Farmers regain markets, manufacturers gain alternatives, Canada regains bargaining power. This isn't ideology, it's pressure politics. There's another layer often overlooked: reliability. In a world where disruptions are becoming routine, stable suppliers gain value. Canadian resources are regulated, Canadian contracts are predictable, Canadian exports don't arrive with sudden political shocks. As instability rises elsewhere, Canada's strategic value rises with it. Energy sits at the center of that equation. China needs oil, Canada has it. That reality ties directly into long-running discussions about expanding westward export capacity. Pipelines aren't just infrastructure anymore, they're leverage, especially when global energy flows are uncertain and traditional suppliers are politically volatile. Zoom out, and the pattern becomes clear. Security anchored through alliances, economic leverage expanded through diversification, diplomatic channels reopened without surrender. This is not confrontation, it's insulation. When intimidation stops working, threats lose power. Canada is not making noise, it is making itself harder to corner. And in an era where trade is weaponized and unpredictability is policy, that may be the most decisive move of all. Because countries don't survive turbulence by choosing sides, they survive by building options.
The moment didn't arrive with breaking news banners or dramatic music. It arrived quietly, and that's exactly why it mattered. a formal state invitation from Beijing. Not a working visit, not a multilateral sidelines meeting, a full state visit, personally extended. In modern geopolitics, that is not courtesy, that is calculation. Because only a few years ago, the relationship between Canada and China was not damaged, it was toxic. Arrests triggered retaliation. Retaliation triggered silence. Diplomacy froze. Trade stalled. Trust collapsed. Many believed the door would stay shut for a generation, and yet now that same door is opening again. Not because wounds healed, but because the world changed faster than anyone expected. This visit is not about friendliness. It is about survival in an unstable system. To understand why this moment is so critical, you have to look at what happened just before it. Canada had just completed a high-stakes European tour, reinforcing ties with NATO and the EU at a time when global security assumptions were unraveling. That anxiety wasn't theoretical, it was triggered by real actions, military force, open threats, and the casual discussion of borders that were once considered inviolable. For decades, many leaders operated under one assumption: aggressive rhetoric might exist, but hard red lines would hold. That assumption no longer exists. When a major power demonstrates that force, sovereignty, and territory are negotiable, every rational state must adjust its strategy immediately. Standing still becomes dangerous. Canada didn't stand still. This is where the misunderstanding begins for many observers. This is not a pivot away from traditional allies. It is not a dramatic break with the United States. It is not a choosing sides moment. It is something far more sophisticated and far more threatening to anyone who relies on leverage through pressure. It is diversification. In Europe, Canada reinforced legitimacy, security, and alliance credibility. In Asia, Canada is reopening economic and diplomatic channels that were once frozen solid. Not because trust has magically returned, but because dependence is a liability in a volatile world. A country tied to one pathway can be squeezed. A country with multiple pathways becomes resilient. State visits are rare for a reason. They are hierarchical signals. They communicate status, seriousness, and strategic interest. China did not extend this invitation because Canada is weak or desperate. It did so because Canada is stable, predictable, and increasingly valuable in a world that is anything but. There is also the personal factor. Leadership matters in geopolitics more than many like to admit. A leader with global financial credibility, institutional trust, and a reputation for calm precision sends a different signal than one driven by spectacle. For Beijing, this represents a chance to re-engage with a Western country that is not posturing, not shouting, and not closing doors for domestic applause. But this visit is not symbolic, it is transactional, and the transactions are sharp. Canada's 100% tariff on Chinese electric vehicles was never purely about China. It was part of a broader alignment strategy under a previous global context. That context has now collapsed. Tariffs are no longer abstract policy tools. They are hitting workers, factories, and supply chains directly. Alignment without protection is no longer sustainable. If those EV tariffs are eased, even partially, and China responds by lifting retaliatory measures on Canadian exports, the impact would be immediate. Agricultural producers regain access, manufacturers gain alternatives. Canada restores bargaining power. This is not theoretical diplomacy, this is pressure politics conducted quietly. And that's where the strategy becomes dangerous for anyone relying on coercion. There is another layer to this story that often goes unnoticed: reliability. In a world increasingly defined by disruption, reliability becomes a premium asset. China doesn't only seek volume, it seeks predictability, and Canada offers something rare: regulated production, transparent contracts, and institutional continuity. Energy sits at the heart of this calculation. China needs oil, Canada has it, and that reality intersects directly with long-running discussions about expanding westward export capacity. Pipelines are no longer just infrastructure projects, they are geopolitical instruments. As global energy markets destabilize and traditional suppliers face political uncertainty, dependable sources gain disproportionate influence. Instability elsewhere doesn't weaken Canada's position, it strengthens it. Calm becomes leverage. Zoom out, and the architecture of the strategy becomes unmistakable. Europe reinforces legitimacy, NATO anchors security, China expands economic leverage. Together, they create something pressure-based systems struggle against: insulation without confrontation. This is not about embarrassing anyone, it is about making threats ineffective. When intimidation stops working, power dynamics shift silently but permanently. This is not defiance for headlines, it is insurance against chaos. Because in a world where annexation threats are spoken aloud and trade is weaponized openly, the countries that survive are not the loudest, they are the most connected, the most adaptable, the most optional. Canada is building options again. And that is why this visit matters far beyond photo ops and press statements. It signals a recalibration of leverage at a moment when leverage determines survival. It shows a country refusing to be boxed in, refusing to be dependent, and refusing to be predictable to those who rely on unpredictability. History doesn't always announce its turning points. Sometimes it whispers them through invitations, meetings, and quiet recalculations. This is one of those moments. Now, the real question is not whether this visit will change the global order overnight. It won't. The real question is whether this marks the beginning of a world where pressure loses its edge and options become power. What do you think? Is Canada making a smart move by reopening this channel now, or is it walking into a dangerous balancing act? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you stayed till the end, you already know why this moment matters.